Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, Boston Public Library, 10 Million Names, and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, the creator and producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, focusing on the years 1860 to 1920 and two remarkable books on the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Civil Rights. On your screen now is the schedule for our 75-minute event. Soon, Professor Bennett Parten will take the screen to discuss his book, Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. Then, Professor Manisha Sinha will share her book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. Following their illustrated presentations, our guest historian, moderator Alan Taylor, will join them. Professor Taylor has some great topics for discussion and questions of his own. Never fear, though, we will also pose some of your questions, which you can enter in any time into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's event is being recorded by my colleagues in American Ancestors Brew Family Learning Center. The raw video will be shared in the hours ahead. Later in the summer, GBH's professionally produced video will be made available to their audience and also to all of you. As good as tonight's program might be, of course, the real education and the delight comes from reading tonight's featured works. Copies of both books can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books on their website. Both books have been heralded by the critics for showing a new perspective on stories we think we know. As you order from the bookstore's website, do input the code AMINS25 and your books will come signed by the authors on book plates. These special copies can be sent to you, your friends, fellow history lovers, or family anywhere in the United States. Now for some background on tonight's guests. Bennett Parten is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University. His area of expertise is the Civil War period. He is a native of Royston, Georgia, and completed his PhD in history at Yale University. His writing has appeared in such publications as The Washington Post, Los Angeles Review of Books, Zocala Public Square, and the Civil War Monitor. Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. Her previous book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, won several awards, including the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. In addition, it was long-listed for the National Book Award in the nonfiction category. Our esteemed moderator this evening, Alan Taylor, is known to many of you as we were fortunate to present him with his recent book, American Civil Wars, earlier this year. Also, in 2023, my organization presented him a Lifetime Achievement Award. Professor Taylor was twice awarded the Pulitzer Prize in History. In addition to his latest book, American Civil Wars, he is the author of American Colonies, American Revolutions, and American Republics, prior volumes in his acclaimed series covering the continental United States. He is the Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Professor Taylor will join us in the second half of our program. For now, though, welcome to you, Bennett Parten. We're delighted you're here. We're glad to get started with you. It's been such a pleasure focusing on your and Professor Sinha's works over the last several weeks. And it's really a testament to you that Professor Taylor is equally admiring. On behalf of the Boston Public Library as well, I want to say it's really an honor to host the three of you. So let's jump right over to you, Ben Parten, and we can cover all the angles of history in our short time together. Over to you.
All right. Well, Margaret, thank you for that very kind introduction. And let me just say thank you to American Ancestors and all the other sponsors for inviting me to speak here, and I'm really looking forward to it. And if you will just give me one moment, I will share my screen and we will jump right into the presentation. And so tonight, I'm really looking forward to answering questions at the end of the program and having a conversation about the book then. But I do want to talk a little bit about the book and some of its big ideas. But I think maybe the best place to start is to start by saying a little bit about just how this book was born. And what I've been telling folks when I've been going around speaking about the book is that there's really two stories, a long story and then a short story. And the long story has to do with the fact that I was born and raised in Royston, Georgia, which is about 20 miles north of Athens. And once a year, maybe twice, three, four times a year, my family would drive down to the Low Country, to Savannah, Jekyll Island, for those of you who know the Georgia coast, Hilton Head or Fripp Island on the South Carolina coast. And for all of that journey, except maybe the first 30 minutes, you were traveling on the path of Sherman's march, driving past farms on roads that the Army would have marched down. And then when my family got to the coast, as much as I enjoyed sitting on the beach or fishing or playing golf, what I really loved to do is just exploring the Low Country. And so when it came time to work on a history project, what I knew I wanted to do was do a project on the Civil War, but also really wanted to do a project on two places that mean so much to me, both my home state of Georgia as well as the Low Country in general. And I would like to think this book was born there, just my own experiences and memories growing up. But the shorter, perhaps more direct story about how this book was born has to do with me reading a work of fiction. Some folks in the audience may be familiar with E.L. Doctorow, who's a fantastic historical fiction author. He's one of the best we've ever had as a nation. He's probably best remembered for his book Ragtime, which is a wonderful book about America at the turn of the 20th century. But Doctorow also tried his hand at writing about Sherman's March in a novel he called simply The March. And as was Doctorow's characteristic style, he wrote with a wide swath of characters in mind. Uh, Sherman appears as a character for him. There are two Confederate prisoners of war who are, in some ways, the tragically comic characters in the story. There's a German-born U.S. Army surgeon, among many others. But Doctorow also included within his story a freedwoman by the name of Wilma Jones, who, as Sherman's army is advancing through Georgia, drops everything, flees her plantation, runs to the army, and then follows the army all the way to Savannah. And you later learn, actually, that Jones is the mother of another character that appears, or maybe a grandmother of another character that appears in one of Doctorow's stories, but I won't spoil that for anyone. Nonetheless, it occurred to me when I was reading about Jones that she was likely not a singular character, that instead she was likely a composite character. And there were likely many of hundreds, if not thousands, of Wilma Joneses or folks just like her who experienced this march. And so it occurred to me, or at least the question that really sparked this book, is whether or not we could tell Wilma Jones's story as a matter of real history and not just historical fiction. And in many ways, it was this question that launched this book. And in some ways, as I wrote the book, I always saw myself working on the kind of nonfiction companion piece to Doctorow's fictional work in The March. And so if we fast forward to now, uh, that's what my book does. It is, as its subtitle implies, it is a history of emancipation in the wake of Sherman's march through Georgia. And I should say that I'm able to tell this story in part because when Sherman arrives on the outskirts of Savannah in late December of 1864, he speculates that there are as many as 20,000 freed refugees from slavery that had followed his army all the way to the coast. That's 20,000 Wilma Joneses, 20,000 people who had fled plantations, run to the army, and then followed the army all the way to Savannah. We should recognize this is an extraordinary number. That 20,000 number is about a third of Sherman's overall army. It is double the size of Atlanta in 1860, and it is roughly equivalent of Savannah's population in 1860, which was Georgia's largest city. So we're talking about a refugee movement of just epic, massive proportions. And so what my book does that is new and novel is that it puts this refugee movement and this refugee experience at the very center of the story of Sherman's March to the Sea. Now, many of you will likely not be surprised to know that this is not traditionally how the story of Sherman's March has been told. Um, Instead, for much of the past century, historians have debated or argued about whether or not Sherman's march through Georgia represented the birth of what's known as total war, meaning did Sherman's tactics in Georgia preview what would come later on the fields of Europe in the First and Second World War and other modern conflicts like Vietnam? And the short answer is no, and we can maybe talk about this in the Q&A later if we want. But nonetheless, for folks who have seen Gone with the Wind, you know the key scene in that film is the scene of Atlanta all ablaze. And I can tell you from my own personal experience as a Georgian, right, that you still sometimes come across Southerners who see Sherman as something of an enemy or something of a war criminal because of the tactics used here in Georgia. And the upshot of all this is that within our popular memory of what the march was, we have always seen it as a military event first and foremost. But for enslaved people, the march was always much more than simply a military event. For them, the march was a liberation event or a real freedom movement. Uh, and I mean this, on the one hand, in a very real and grassroots sense, in the sense that this was a campaign that conquered the Confederacy, that destroyed slavery. It was a campaign in which many tens of thousands of people experienced freedom as a consequence of the Army's movements. It was a campaign in which close to 20,000 freed people tried to make freedom mean something and tried to define freedom by following the Army as it marched on to Savannah, sometimes enduring incredible hardships just to get to where the Army was going. And what you see on the screen is an image that is not from Georgia, it's actually from Virginia in 1862, but it is nonetheless, I think, representative of freed people fleeing plantations and marching along with the army. That's what that image there depicts. And if I could just hash out this 20,000 number a little bit further, that does not take into account the men and women who ran to the army, but then decided maybe to not make the march on to Savannah. It also doesn't include the men and women who followed the army, but then turned back or were turned back by the army somewhere along the way. It also just doesn't take into account the people who experience freedom as a consequence of the movement. And so this is where the subtitle comes in. You take all these different factors together, or you combine them together, what you get is a campaign that quite likely was the largest emancipation event in American history, and a campaign that did, in effect, and on the ground, what the Emancipation Proclamation could only ever do on paper. But I also refer to the march as a freedom movement in a much larger, somewhat more abstract sense. The reality is that the size of this refugee movement, following along behind Sherman's army, would go on to have enormous consequences for what the early stages of Reconstruction would look like. Everything from the shape and nature of the Freedmen's Bureau to the success and failure of land reform on the Georgia coast to even the meaning of freedom itself, all has plot points and storylines that point back to Sherman's march and his arrival in Savannah right before Christmas in 1864. And so in that sense, while we can think of the march as one of the last campaigns of the Civil War, we can also think of it as one of the early battles of Reconstruction and what the post-war world would look like. And that, in many ways, points to the book's ultimate argument, which is that, yes, the march was a Civil War campaign, but it was also a key moment in the history of American freedom. Yes, we can see it as an equivalent to Shiloh, Gettysburg, some of these other key moments in the history of the Civil War. But in some ways, I think the better way to think about it is as a Selma, Alabama in 1965, a Lincoln at Gettysburg, Yorktown, Philadelphia in 1776. one of these touchstone moments for what we think about when we think about what American freedom actually means. Now, I do want to say just a little bit more about what the march would have looked like in Georgia and what it would have looked like on the ground. And just for context sake, what I want to point out is that the march begins in mid-November 1864. In the East, in Virginia, Grant has Lee's army pinned down at Petersburg, which is a railroad crossing just south of Richmond. And in Georgia, Sherman's army had just taken Atlanta, which was a major victory for the army in the West. Atlanta was the Confederacy's last great industrial hub, still standing. And so the Savannah campaign, the March to the Sea, is the movement that comes directly after that. It's a movement of about 60,000 soldiers across maybe 250 miles, taking the better part of maybe a month and a half. Except this wasn't your average ordinary campaign. One of the things that Sherman did in pulling out of Atlanta was cut loose from his base of supplies. And so he instructed his men to forage off the countryside, both for their own fuel and their own sustenance, but also to wreak havoc on the White South's material and emotional wherewithal to continue keeping up the fight. And I should say this is not really a surprise coming from Sherman himself. He had long been a kind of apostle for a much harder style of warfare. He really developed his views while serving as the military governor of Memphis in 1862, where he dealt with the problem of Confederate guerrillas, of Confederate partisans firing on civilian ships plying up and down the Mississippi River. And in response, he would often march soldiers out to the villages that harbored those partisans and burn them, sometimes leaving one structure just to mark where those villages were on the map. And then he would later begin expelling white Memphis families every time a ship or one of his men were fired on by one of those partisan guerrilla soldiers.
Here on the farms and estates of Middle and South Georgia, enslaved people acted as third-party brokers in their own freedom. They routinely offered the army military intelligence, excuse me. Sherman even himself regularly met with enslaved people to ask about the landscape or Confederate troop movements. And best of all, white families would regularly hide many of their goods or their livestock in advance of the army. But of course, they themselves didn't do any of the hiding themselves. They forced enslaved people to do it. And so when Sherman's army arrived on the plantations, those enslaved people were generally very ready and eager to hand over those goods to Sherman's army and sometimes use that knowledge as a kind of bargaining chip to get them or to allow them to continue on with the army. An even better example of just how crucial enslaved people were to the army's operations had to do with what happened as the army approached Savannah. Here on the rice swamps just north of Savannah, those plantations were much less abundant. They'd already been picked over. And so there were real questions about whether or not the army would find enough food to sustain themselves. But in these hectic, harried few days, enslaved people actually sustained the army by feeding the soldiers rice. They taught soldiers how to use the mortar and pestle to hull and prepare the rice. And so they became really critical in helping Sherman's army sustain themselves as they approached Savannah. And if I can just leave you with one final example of just how critical and crucial enslaved people were to the army's progress, it's that enslaved men who ran to the army were often employed as military pioneers. And what the pioneer is a term that refers to all sorts of manual laborers who traveled with the army. And in many cases, these pioneers would do things like dig latrines, dig trenches, other types of grunt work. But on the march, to be a pioneer was to be a road builder. They would travel out in front of Sherman's army and prepare the road for the army to march on. And so that leaves us with this powerful mental image of the fact that wherever Sherman's army went in Georgia, there were always scores of freed people traveling out of the head of the army, quite literally paving the army's way to Savannah, which again is a pretty powerful image for what this march would have looked like and for the role that enslaved people played in it. And so I think I am going to stop my comments there. I'm looking forward to picking things back up in the Q&A. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass things over to Professor Sinha.
Thank you, Ben. I am going to start sharing my screen as I begin my talk, which is drawn from my new book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic. And I came to this project because, as Margaret mentioned, and thank you, Margaret, for that introduction, and to American Ancestors for hosting us. I came to this project because I had written a book on abolition, and I wanted to know what happened to the abolitionist project, which was not just the destruction of slavery, but also for Black civic and political equality. My first monograph was on Southern slaveholders and pro-slavery ideology. I was finally writing about people I liked. So this book, of course, focuses on the debate over who is a citizen and the role of the state in expanding or constricting rights, but also in containing indigenous sovereignty, that is Native Americans, in the aftermath of the American Civil War. Now, Reconstruction is usually understood as the period immediately following the war, from around 1865 to the Compromise of 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes is elected to the presidency and the last Reconstruction state governments fall in the South. Now, my book, as you will see just from the dates in the subtitle, expands the purview of Reconstruction considerably. It starts with the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860 and ends only with the end of the 19th century. It pays a lot of attention to the process of emancipation during the war and Reconstruction itself, when the American Republic and the Constitution was remade or reconstructed. And then it does something that most historians of Reconstruction don't do, which is to look at the long unwinding of Reconstruction from 1877 until 1900, when Black citizenship is overthrown in the southern states, and you have a regime of disfranchisement for Black men, racial segregation, violence, sharecropping, debt peonage, convict lease labor system, or what most historians call slavery by another name. So, of course, the crucial question of Reconstruction remains this. How did interracial democracy progress under the revolutionary impetus of the Civil War and emancipation, and why did that effort unravel by the end of the 19th century? Reconstruction, we know, birthed a national citizenship, expanding the boundaries of political belonging, rights, and claims on the nation state. Building a composite nation, as the self-emancipated abolitionist Frederick Douglass put it, was the greatest challenge of what I call the Second American Republic. It was a fraught and contested project. Over 720,000 Americans died in the Civil War. We know that another 100,000 indigenous people perished in wars, in reservations, and in assimilation campaigns in the second half of the 19th century. But 4 million enslaved people won their freedom and citizenship, only to be subjected to a new regime of racist terror after the overthrow of Reconstruction. Despite the emergence of the suffrage movement, women remained disfranchised. Asian immigrants were excluded in the latter half of the 19th century. And strikes by workers of all ethnicities were violently put down. So in looking at this long unwinding of Reconstruction, I don't look just at the South, but also at what is happening in the rest of the nation, and how the overthrow of Reconstruction and the narrowing of democracy affects everyone. Now, it is not only the scope and the chronology of my book, which is somewhat different, But my interpretation also challenges conventional narratives of American history that have generally tend to emphasize how the United States was able to develop a unique and long-lasting experiment in self-government by just expanding democracy incrementally but consistently to groups previously denied inclusion. Now, in this prevailing view, the Anglo American tradition of liberal democracy is distinct from the more volatile histories of continental Europe. Or so the story goes. From simplistic histories of American exceptionalism to more sophisticated analyses of democracy in the Western world, the consensus, in fact, cannot explain the violent upheavals of the mid to late 19th century United States. The Civil War itself and the brutal overthrow of Reconstruction by domestic racist terrorism. As President Abraham Lincoln put it in December 1862, quote, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history, meaning the United States does not lie outside global patterns of history. The Civil War resulted in the destruction of what I call the First American Republic and birthed the Second. And my notion of the Second American Republic comes from the history of French republicanism. Now, of course, this is not a perfect match. The French have had 5 republics and 5 different constitutions. The United States, on the other hand, has remade its republic through constitutional amendments and federal law periodically. But I think it's a useful analogy for those who might be unfamiliar with the many twists and turns in the history of American democracy. And in borrowing this terminology from French republicanism to describe events in the United States, I seek to highlight the growth of reactionary authoritarianism in the post war South, a type of politics that we often associate with the rest of the world or the rest of the Americas. Put simply, the long afterlives of slavery and the downfall of Reconstruction are as important to understanding United States history as are more familiar ameliorative tales about the abolition of slavery and the expansion of democracy and citizenship rights during Reconstruction. The story of the contest between the two is designed to capture an essential and ongoing theme in United States history, which has never been all one or the other. And again, I depart from much of the recent scholarship in US history that tends to lump all American history under the encompassing framework of racism. That is just as simplistic as the mythic version of American history that it seeks to replace. Now, not only that, but the history of the unmaking of Reconstruction also reveals the significance of the abortive experiment to transform the slaveholders' empire into an interracial democracy. So my goal is to put Reconstruction in a transnational context and to really see how its brief triumph can tell us as much as its long unwinding. Now, other recent work has tried to expand Reconstruction's chronological and spatial boundaries. It's called the Greater Reconstruction Framework. But unlike these histories, I emphasize disjuncture rather than continuity. For instance, to view the bold experiment in interracial democracy that was Southern Reconstruction as the same political process that led to the subjugation of indigenous nations in the West, the rise of nativism, the triumph of imperialism, is to completely miss the contestation that shaped this era. I argue that these events must be seen as part of the long overthrow of Reconstruction rather than as a consequence of the abolitionist aims of the American Civil War. So, where most see the seamless expansion of the American nation and the nation state, I show change and open conflict over democracy, citizenship, sovereignty, and political economy. Now, central to this history is the truly emancipatory moment represented by the new civic democracy of Reconstruction and its significant legacy of progressive constitutionalism and democratic governance. The novel notion that the government is responsible for expanding the rights and maintaining the welfare of all its citizens, regardless of race and previous condition of servitude. Now, debates on the nature of governance, whether all citizens and non-citizens, by which I mean immigrants, which are coming in at this time in large numbers from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from Latin America and Asia, whether all these individuals are rights-bearing individuals and claimants before the state, define the Second American Republic. And these questions are still very much with us today. Now, there can be no doubt that the destruction of racial slavery and the reconstruction of the misbegotten Southern Confederacy fundamentally remade the entire American Republic. That revolution transformed the US Constitution. Long before historians did so, abolitionist William Goodell proclaimed in 1861 in his newspaper, The Principia, that the Civil War was, quote, the Second American Revolution, and portended the national abolition of all inequalities. Abolitionist feminist Angelina Grimke Weld, in her 1863, quote, address of the Women's National Loyal League to the soldiers of our Second American Revolution, argued that the Southern slaveocracy threatened the freedom of all American citizens and sought to enslave all working men, regardless of color. So the abolitionist vision, what I call abolition democracy, borrowing from W.E.B. Du Bois, but also from my own work on abolition, this abolition democracy was supposed to transform the republic, not just with the end of slavery, but also raise questions about labor, about women, about immigrants, and Native Americans. Now, we know, of course, that the Second American Republic, born during the Civil War, was a massive course correction in United States history. And it was an unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy and Black citizenship. It established national citizenship and increased the powers of the federal government considerably to ensure the civil and political rights of its most vulnerable citizens. It also expanded the boundaries of national belonging and social claims on the nation state. It raised issues of native sovereignty, naturalization of immigrants that had been previously restricted to whites. In 1870, a new law actually expanded it to people of African descent. And it raised issues of emancipation and enfranchisement of women. So the Reconstruction Constitution and laws that created the Second American Republic would have to be systematically misinterpreted by the United States Supreme Court and overthrown before we came to the place where this abolition democracy was and its achievements were completely undone. And if you look at what I have here, just all these federal laws and constitutional amendments that are passed during Reconstruction, beginning with emancipation, which, as Professor Parten mentioned, was involved not just the president issuing an Emancipation Proclamation, but in fact, the enslaved themselves defecting to Union Army lines. But we don't see it as an event, we see it as a process now, especially one that involved the president, the enslaved, the Union Army, Congress, radical Republicans in Congress, and of course, abolitionists who were always agitating for Black rights outside the formal political structures. The Reconstruction constitutional amendments, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment establishing national citizenship by birthright or naturalization, very much in the news today, and of course the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. These amendments completely remade the Republic, as did some extremely important federal laws. The big expansion of the responsibilities of the federal government with the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, which can be seen as the establishment of a social state, where the Bureau, oversee I should say, not just the transition to freedom, but also provided relief, established hospitals, schools, and of course the historically Black colleges and universities that remain with us today. The enforcement acts to put down domestic terrorism by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. The rally against big government in the South begins right here during Reconstruction. And in this, I include the Civil Rights Acts, the first federal civil rights acts ever passed in this country's history, including the one in 1875 that was declared unconstitutional because it actually outlawed Jim Crow before the South established it. The 19th Amendment is something that I include too within the Reconstruction constitutional change, which many historians don't, mainly because the suffrage movement took off during Reconstruction. And the 19th Amendment, its wording closely followed that of the 15th Amendment. Of course, it was passed in the defeat of Reconstruction and its overthrow. So, as I said earlier, unlike previous works on Reconstruction, the second half of my book really concentrates on the unwinding of this abolition democracy. It pays a lot of attention to the period after 1877, late 19th century, and in connecting the struggle for Black citizenship with debates over ethnicity, gender, economic autonomy, and sovereignty that raged at the same time, I aim to show that we have missed much by confining our story of the end of Reconstruction to the South. It is, in fact, a compelling example of how American democracy can be overthrown for a large period in American history, and that is so pertinent for our own fraught times. So, of course, it took a long time for these gains to be undone, and it is this period that most historians of Reconstruction ignore. The massive economic and political dislocations of the Gilded Age that followed Reconstruction were not just a product of the changes wrought by the Civil War and Reconstruction. They were also a result of the defeat of the prior era's emancipatory legacy. They represented, to borrow the words of a historian of modern Europe, Arno J. Meyer, quote, the persistence of the old regime, a virulently anti-democratic hierarchical politics that persisted in the post-Reconstruction South and justified a new global political economy of imperialism. In the end, the defeat of Black freedom would be the defeat of American democracy as a whole. And the United States entered into a period of what I call American Thermidor, again borrowing from the history of French republicanism. And in my view, it's really the 1890s that are a crucial decade in understanding the downfall of Reconstruction. Many historians now even debate whether there was a so-called compromise of 1877. It is in this period that we see the takeoff of the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of Chinese exclusion acts that becomes a model for restrictive nativist immigration acts that favored Northern Europeans versus Southern and Eastern Europeans and people from all the rest of the world. It's in 1890 that Southern states, beginning with Mississippi, start systematically disfranchising Black men in their state constitutions. It's the end of Native, especially Lakota sovereignty in the West. The Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 points to that. And of course, at the end of this decade, the Spanish-American-Cuban War allows the United States to once again become an empire, the slaveholders' dream of an empire that would extend to the Caribbean, Latin America, the Pacific. And the United States annexes Hawaii, Puerto Rico, colonizes the Philippines. And so what I call Jim Crow colonialism comes together with the establishment of Jim Crow in the South. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 gives the green light for that. And of course, the establishment of an overseas American empire whose inhabitants are declared by the Supreme Court to be outside the purview of the protections of the US Constitution, especially the 14th Amendment that had been passed during Reconstruction. Now, I have an image here of the Wilmington Light Infantry from North Carolina, who were responsible for a coup and a massacre of African Americans in Wilmington, North Carolina. Some of the last interracial governments in the South actually fell only in the 1890s in Tennessee, in Virginia, and North Carolina. And I put this image up because this Wilmington Light Infantry that participated in this coup and massacre of the Black population of Wilmington had just returned from the Spanish-Cuban-American War, showing the connections in a way between the overthrow of Reconstruction and the rise of American empire. So the rise and fall of the Second American Republic, or the achievements, as well as the overthrow of Reconstruction, is the crucible when our modern political traditions, both conservative and liberal, were formed, and they continue to shape our present politics in ways little understood by many Americans. Which is to say that the triumph of imperialism and of Jim Crow by the end of the 19th century was also contested. Resistance to it would bear fruit in the populist and progressive movements, eventually with the New Deal. Later still in the 20th century, the civil rights movement inaugurated the second reconstruction of American democracy. So if you look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it says to implement the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution passed in 1870, nearly a century ago. Today, the attempt to unravel the New Deal state and civil rights law and the advent of a new Gilded Age with unprecedented in economic inequality reveal that the great contest between democracy and authoritarianism, equality and inequality, interracialism and racism, feminism and patriarchy is far from over. Thanks so much for listening, and I would welcome your questions and a conversation with Professor Taylor. I think we are going to the conversation section of this presentation. I will stop sharing my screen, and here we go.
Well, thank you very much, Manisha. And I want to thank both you and Ben for the books you've written. I learned a great deal from reading both of them, and I found both of them a pleasure to read as well. So I want to pose some questions. First, I'm going to ask a question of you, Manisha, and they're mostly questions about thinking about yourselves as writers. And one of the things that you pull off in this book is you not only tell the story of the Southern reaction against Reconstruction, but also about the conquest of the West and the subordination of Native people there. And then you explore the emergence of American imperialism beyond the continent on a more global scale. So what was the challenge for you as you're developing this book on how you are going to balance your narration and attend to topics that historians ordinarily deal with separately?
That's a wonderful question. That's a great question. And as a historian, I realize, that we sort of lie at the cusp of the humanities and the social sciences, and I struggle sometimes to balance the narrative with analysis, especially in a book like this. My first book was a straight out academic book. The second one sort of fell, I think, a book. But with this one, I was really aiming it to a broad American audience. Not just to my undergraduate students and my graduate students, but also to a broader audience. And so I was careful to also tell stories and develop characters in the book so that you have a narrative of these people. And then I would push, sort of literally force myself to develop the analytic framework. There are a lot of historians, especially independent historians, who don't do that. But I think it was important to do that because we can't assume that the reader is going to connect those dots. And as you said, because this book was trying to connect, like tell Reconstruction as a national and even as a global history, that it was trying to connect the events that are happening in the South with what's happening in the rest of the nation, especially in the West, but also with the rise of American imperialism, formal American empire outside the continental boundaries. It was tough to do. And at times, I struggled to do that myself. And Hopefully it works now, but I did not want to lose the analysis in just telling a simple story. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. Now, this is a question primarily for Ben, which has to do with your narration of the story of Sherman's March. I'm most familiar with accounts of Sherman's March, which are military history, in which the focus is on Sherman and his leadership. I was struck by the degree to which Sherman's not in control of this march. It's not only he can't control the refugees that are coming to his army, but he can't control his own men, and he can't control his own subordinate generals. So this is a book in which it's really fundamentally a social history of a social movement in which there are two social movements. One is of this complex army, and the other is of these people who are self-emancipating with the assistance of the army or making the army assist them. So how did you come to that particular perspective on the march, and what difference does it make?
Yeah, that's another really great question. I'm glad you presented it as a social history of the march, because that is one of the kind of starting points that I began this project from, is to write a kind of social history of the march. There have been books that focused on the social history of the march from the perspective of the soldiers, but I really wanted to flip the script and focus on enslaved people and try to draw on, the great work that's been done by folks like Demoy Glymph, W.B. Du Bois, Steve Hahn, so many other great historians who've worked on slave politics and the social history of the plantation, and really bring that literature and that perspective to such a well-known Civil War episode. And you're absolutely right about Sherman. But one of the things that I wanted to deliberately do in this story is to frame Sherman at the beginning and then bring him in at the end, but nonetheless leave the actual march itself, essentially leaves Sherman out of it in a way that we could focus exclusively on the movements of enslaved people and the reactions and their interactions with the soldiers, and really try to understand how the march and how emancipation played out in a very localized, intimate setting, like individual plantations here in Georgia. And you're absolutely correct. I mean, Sherman was someone who wanted to have absolute control over this march. He issues a refugee order of sorts that suggests that enslaved people who come to the army may be taken along so long as they are able-bodied and can essentially care for themselves. But that order itself is very conceited, because it suggests that he and his men will be the one who decide what emancipation looks like. And the story of Sherman's March is a story in which enslaved people prove him to be incorrect. And I think the payoff of really flipping the script here in viewing the march from the perspective of enslaved people is we can understand just how enslaved people kept freedom at the very front and center of what this campaign would actually mean. And we can see that in Georgia as the campaign unfolds, but we can especially see it once the army arrives on the coast. And what happens in Georgia begins to interact with what's happening in South Carolina and elsewhere, and really sets the stage for what Reconstruction will look like in its earliest days.
Thank you. So this is a question for both of you, and this goes to Sherman. So Sherman appears in both of your books. He primarily appears in different contexts, and in Ben's book, he's primarily in Georgia and South Carolina during the Civil War. Manisha's book, he appears more in the West afterwards. And so I'm just wondering how you would each assess Sherman, because in Bennett's book, he's a reluctant emancipator, it seems. Maybe Ben would disagree with that, who comes along a fair distance. But in Manisha's book, he's kind of quite a zealous dispossessor and killer of Indians. So it's the same person doing in these two different roles. How do we reconcile them?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure. Well, or maybe I can go first because it's chronologically first, and then we can maybe move there. And I'll just say, I think you have your finger right on who Sherman was. He is someone who enters the war as someone who doesn't believe that emancipation should have any role in it. He thinks that slavery is a pretext for secession and not the actual cause of the war. And he is very reluctant at best to embrace emancipation. He keeps this perspective all the way through to the end of the war, though by 1864 he has evolved, if ever so slightly, in the sense that now he views targeting slavery as a way to end the war, and he knows that styling himself as a liberator and evolving just ever so slightly is good for him politically. And he's pushed to this perspective in part because he comes from a very well-connected family in Eastern Ohio. His brother is a senator. His foster father was a former senator. He's a Whig, but is surrounded by foster brothers who are all Republicans who are always pushing him on this issue. And he puts his feet in the mud, but he does eventually evolve ever so slightly. And I'm eager to hear what Professor Sinha has to say, but I think the way we can kind of reconcile these two positions is to recognize just the sheer messiness and complexity of this 30-year period, right from the Civil War to the sort of movement into the West. And I think Sherman is a perfect person to think about this transition or the fact that there is such a quick transition from the Civil War to immediately turning to the West. I mean, Sherman leaves the Civil War, goes to St. Louis by August of 1865, directly from the Grand Review in Washington, D.C., and immediately is theorizing about what dispossession could look like. And so his career, in some respects, shows just how intertwined these two endeavors, both ending the war and then pursuing a form of American empire, truly are.
Yes, so sorry.
Go ahead.
To pick up on this question, you know, Sherman, Sheridan, and Grant are the fighting Union Army generals, right? And whatever their views are before the war, you know, they come during the war to understand that emancipation and black recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army are crucial for Union victory. It all goes hand in hand. And Sherman is perhaps the most conservative of all three of these fighting Union generals who turned the tide of the war. And but he's the one who issues the most radical order during the war, which is Sherman's Field Order Number 15, that redistributes land in 40-acre plots with a mule from the Union Army to African Americans in the Low Country rice area, South Carolina and Georgia and the Sea Islands. And this demand emerges from Black people themselves. It's really interesting. And in my book, I kind of discovered reading the secondary and primary literature that the 40 acres actually even preceded Field Order Number 15, and it came under Lincoln when they started confiscating plantations for non-payment of taxes, even before that. But not to get sidetracked, I would say that Sherman during the war is praised widely by abolitionists. After the war, when he in fact becomes the general commander in chief of the Western Theater in St. Louis, in Missouri, and he's involved in the Indian Wars, he actually studies, he sends people to study colonial tactics that the British had employed in India to see how to dispossess Native Americans. So many Civil War historians see the Indian Wars as simply a continuation of the Civil War. You subjugate the South and then the West. And I completely disagree with that. And Sherman knew that. Whatever he did during the March to the Sea, the Union Army was actually quite its record in terms of crimes against civilian population and how they are prosecuted within court martials is actually quite exemplary under Lincoln's Code of War. But when it comes to Indian warfare, they behave like European colonial powers. You know, they kill women and children, they destroy entire villages. And so Sherman knew that this was a different war. He was also very unsympathetic to Reconstruction, unlike Grant and Sheridan. Sheridan is also involved in Indian warfare, but Grant really comes to support Black citizenship and rights during his presidency in a way that Sherman doesn't. He is very unsympathetic to the Reconstruction project. And that's when abolitionists start criticizing Sherman, and I paid a lot of attention to what abolitionists are saying and doing at this time because most historians don't pay attention to them. And they tell Sherman that your war crimes against Native nations is similar to the ones that Confederate generals had perpetrated against Union Army soldiers, predominantly African American, like Nathan Bedford Forrest in the Fort Pillow massacre. So, like, really telling him that you're no longer the conquering war hero of the Union. You have now become as brutal as the Confederates that you had conquered. And that I imagine that Sherman and Sheridan didn't take very kindly to that reaction. So I do think that unlike most Civil War historians, I don't see the Indian Wars as a continuation of the Civil War. It's a completely different project. It's a colonial project to dispossess and conquer Native nations in the West.
Thank you. So a question that came from the chat from our audience has to do with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass also appears in both of your books as a very compelling witness to what he's seeing. I wonder if you could each comment about how you used Frederick Douglass as a witness to tell your stories.
Professor Sinha, may let you go first. You have the great quote on the PowerPoint. Yeah.
All right. So, as I said, I pay a lot of attention to the way abolitionists and women are reacting and writing about changes occurring in this period. And you have people like Frederick Douglass and Garrison, even who is very critical of the Chinese Exclusion Act or the dispossession of Native Americans. What's so wonderful about, or what's tragic, I should say, about Frederick Douglass, that he lives long enough to see. I mean, he dies in 1895. So the question is great because he lives long enough to see that abolition democracy completely overthrown in the South. And that's such a tragedy for him to have witnessed that in his long life. And I have another quote from him at the end of my book, I think close in the epilogue, where he says, this is just before he dies. He says, once the wheel of progress starts turning backwards, you never know where it will stop. And I think that's such a wonderful quote for our times too, is that unless you fight for democracy and push back, it'll keep rolling backwards. And that's what he saw just before he died.
Mhm.
Yeah, so Douglass appears in my book somewhat early as Sherman's army is marching to Atlanta because this is, I think, pretty indicative of how Sherman viewed emancipation, the role of free people in it. He always resisted the incorporation of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, into his army. This is something that he refused to accommodate. And as he is marching his army to Atlanta on the outskirts, he gets into a bit of a tiff with Lincoln. Lincoln writes him wanting him to cooperate on this issue. And Sherman essentially plays him off. He doesn't want to answer Lincoln. And he says, we'll talk about this more after Atlanta falls, which is a heck of a thing to do to your commander in chief, right? To essentially snub him that way. And of course, Douglass was a great champion of the USCT. He had helped recruit and enlist and convince Lincoln and others to allow for the enlistment of Black troops. And so we see Sherman and Douglass have this kind of point counterpoint perspective as it relates to Black troops on the build up to or the lead up to Atlanta. And then in Reconstruction, they have a similar perspective. Once the campaign is over, we can really see both of those two characters being kind of point counterpoint for what Reconstruction and the future of the Low Country might look like.
And I'd invite each of you to broaden beyond these famous characters like Douglass and Sherman, and because you do bring in more obscure characters who help you tell your story and make it a more human scale story. Could you each think of a character who would probably not be so familiar to our audience, but who became very compelling to you as writers?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I guess I could start. There's one character that is very important to this project. His name was Henry Hitchcock. He was a Missouri politician who'd worked in the state of Missouri to rewrite Missouri state constitution as the war is unfolding. And he joined Sherman's army right before the march begins, largely because he wants to have his taste of the war. He pulls some strings to get a position on Sherman's personal staff. And so he rides along and experiences the march right alongside Sherman. And then he will go on to write a phenomenal diary of his experiences serving as Sherman's staff officer. He makes incredible observations about what he's seeing in Georgia. And he is really a Sherman booster. He supports Sherman wholly, protects his reputation, but he's also a real war booster and a real supporter for the Union cause. And so when he goes onto these plantations, he talks about what the Confederacy is as a project. He talks about the nature of slavery and plantation life, and he talks directly to enslaved people to get their perspective. He asks them, he's a lawyer by training, he asks them searching questions about what the war might mean. Um, but I also use him because he also travels with a manservant who is a freed person named Alec, who he actually refuses to bring up in his diary. He doesn't mention much about Alec's role in the campaign itself. But the fact is we have Hitchcock's diary and we have his thoughtful responses because each night when the army rested and camp was struck, Alec was there to make sure that he had the time and the ability to sit down and actually draft his diary. And so Hitchcock becomes a really compelling character for me because he narrates so much of the march and he asks the kind of questions that as historians, you always want your historical characters to be asking. And so he's someone that is really pivotal because he illuminates so many other voices in the course of his diary.
So this is a tough question for me, Alan, because so many of my favorite characters, the radical Republicans, the abolitionists, whom people surprisingly still don't know much about, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, Garrison, Douglas, all are, in the book, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, other feminists. But the people who really caught my attention were those who were involved in what I call grassroots reconstruction, African Americans at the grassroots, especially in states like South Carolina and Mississippi that tended to have Black majority populations, how they implemented Reconstruction. So even there, I can't pick one. It's like asking a mother to pick your favorite child. They're all equal in my eyes. But three of them really stood out to me. One was Robert Elliott from South Carolina. His speeches, if you read them in the Congressional Globe on the Civil Rights Act, were the best and amazing. And he's directly addressing Confederates who made their way back into Congress, insurrectionists who are back in Congress. And his speeches are just amazing. And he talks about the racial violence against Black people in the South. And I love this quote from him where he says, "Pray tell me, who is the barbarian here?" And you had another man like called Prince Rivers, who was an enslaved man who actually developed an independent Black township in Hamburg. And there are a lot of them like that. I think Professor Painter had a question about labor, who were interested not just in Black and civil rights, but were really interested also in working men's rights, in trying to make sure that the first lien in the sharecropping system went to the cultivator rather than the planter, in fair wages. They were really interested in joining with the Knights of Labor and other labor organizations that had emerged at that time. So Prince Rivers is a remarkable man, and after the overthrow of Reconstruction, he kind of goes back to driving a carriage, which he did under the days of slavery. And the last one I'd mentioned, sorry, is John Lynch, who wrote one of the first books on Reconstruction. We often think of Reconstruction, we think of the Dunning School and their very biased, highly racist views of Reconstruction. What I did find with the Dunning School was that they ended up justifying American imperialism by showing that Reconstruction failed. So for me, that was a great find because people know about the Dunning School, but they don't know what big imperialists they were too. But the first person to really write a history of Reconstruction was an African American from Mississippi who had been a congressman, John Lynch. He wrote a book called The Facts of Reconstruction, which was really trying to combat not just the lost cause mythologies of the Civil War, but also this notion that Reconstruction was this horrible experiment that gave Black people rights before, quote, they were ready for it. So these men and women in the grassroots really, I think they're the people that people should know more about. Both Du Bois and Eric Foner have talked about them, but the individual characters are actually quite interesting.
So thank you. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask an impossibly complex question, which is both of your books deal with the Civil War as opening doors for emancipation, for interracial democracy, but you both end the story showing that these were defeated. So you're dealing with this larger story, this mega story, which is of retrenchment and defeat. But you also don't want that to be the whole story. You're also, as you just done, Manisha, you want to bring in characters who show that throughout this period, there's resistance. So I would like each of you concisely to just say, how did you approach this great challenge? Ben, do you want to get a start on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a huge challenge because I'm someone who thinks that Reconstruction clearly absolutely mattered. The types of achievements that Professor Sinha mentioned in her presentation are real. They matter. They're serious. We should take them serious. But it's also clear that when you look in the Low Country in the 1865 and the months right after the end of the Civil War, it's pretty clear that retrenchment is taking place very soon. And one of the things that I tried to just show in the book is just how messy and how complicated the situation on the ground truly was, and how the Civil War, yes, created real momentum for achieving these types of achievements that Professor Sinha spoke about and the real gains of Reconstruction. But the messiness of the war, the complications of the war, also set in motion a alternative set of momentum, I suppose you could say, that will ultimately allow for some of those achievements on the ground in the South right after the war to be undermined very quickly as well. And so I simply just tried to focus on the messiness of the process of it all as it unfolds in the spring and summer months of 1865.
Great, thank you. Manisha?
Yeah, so you're right. This is a big challenge because I do end the book at the moment of defeat. But I think what I try to do in the book, and what I also try to convey in terms of the history of what is known as the nadir in Black history, the nadir in the history of American democracy, is also that the resistance, as you mentioned, Alan, never dies. So they're no longer in power, but the resistance continues. So, for instance, the Black Convention movement, they're still meeting in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and proposing new civil rights organizations. This is the seeds being laid for the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. So resistance doesn't really die at this point. And I think it's important to remember this concept that I like a lot about contestation, and how the contest, even in the triumph of Jim Crow and imperialism, and it's really not a great period in American history. Even then, people are contesting this, and they kind of lay the groundwork for that longer struggle that sort of culminates in the civil rights movement. And I think it's important to recognize that. I tell that to my students too, and mainly because I'm by nature optimistic, so I hate to end. I don't like unhappy endings.
Okay. So I want to thank both of you and turn it over to Margaret.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Professor Sinha, for ending on a positive note, and you too, Ben, all of the remarkable achievements of that era. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Author Series, we've asked tonight's guests, our two featured authors, to read a passage from their new books. So first to you, Ben, and then to Manisha.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me just say again, thanks for having me tonight. It's been a real pleasure and honor to be here. And so I think it's only fitting that I read the very first chapter of the book. This is going to start here with the introduction, and it tells a story about family and a possible family reunion. So in the late fall of 1864, as General William Tecumseh Sherman's Union Army marched toward Savannah, Sally, a freed woman, roamed the camps at night searching for her children. Ever since she and her husband Ben had joined the army on its march to the sea, she'd been asking everyone she met for any clue into her children's whereabouts. When she encountered freed people who fled to the army and joined the march just like her, she would scan their faces and scrutinize them closely, hoping that by chance she might detect some distinguishing feature, a smile, scar, or mannerism, something only a mother would know and never forget. Her evening rounds became a camp ritual. Everyone knew of her search, even the soldiers, though most felt that she might as well have been searching for a, quote, needle in a haystack. In fact, all Sally knew was that 10 years before, one of her children, her 8-year-old daughter Nan, had been sold to the, quote, lower country, and that Nan might be down there yet. Late one evening, as the army neared Savannah, Sally got the news she'd been hoping for. A friend told her that he'd heard someone call his wife Nan, and the woman just might be her daughter. Struck by the news, Sally stopped what she was doing, praised God, and did what any mother would do. She started running. Thank you.
So I'm going to read a passage from my book that again highlights what my book on Reconstruction tries to do, which previous historians have not done, which is to look at it as women's history also. Histories of Reconstruction are riddled with simplistic racial dualisms of Northern white teachers and Black freed people, but relatively forgotten Northern Black abolitionist teachers like Ellen Garrison Jackson and Rebecca Primus left behind a record of their work with freed people, the racist abuse they suffered, and their efforts to expand the boundaries of American democracy in fighting for Black and women's rights simultaneously. In her letter to her parents in Hartford, Connecticut, Primus detailed the harassment she and other colored teachers suffered at the hands of, quote, Secesh and Copperhead whites in the South. She hailed, however, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first federal civil rights law in U.S. history, as promising, quote, impartial justice, so that rights which are so unjustly withheld from us now have been obtained. In a subsequent letter, Primus referred to Jackson's suit against a station master in Baltimore for throwing her and another Black teacher, Mary Anderson, out of the ladies' room while they were waiting for their train under the new civil rights law. When the station master, Adam Smizer, tried to settle the case, Jackson wrote to the anti-slavery American Missionary Association's Reverend S. Hunt, quote, we could not agree to compromise just then, and no other time unless we can have all our rights conceded to. She recalled that Southern white woman who had, quote, first insulted us, and how Smizer had grasped my arm so tightly that I felt compelled to cry out, let me alone, take your hand off me. Engaging in the suit, Jackson confessed, required, quote, a great deal of moral courage. To act in the matter is of no trifling subject. She wrote that all the colored people in the area rallied around her and aided her in her lawsuit. Jackson viewed the struggle for equal rights during Reconstruction as a peculiarly women's fight. She noted, quote, our soldiers went forth with sword and bayonet to contend for right and justice. We could not do that. But we contend against outrage and oppression wherever we find it, firmly standing and giving away for the rudest shocks. Black women like Primus and Jackson unveiled a new understanding of American democracy during Reconstruction, where Black and women's rights were not competing, but overlapping struggles. They refused to heed the siren call of some white suffragists who would pit one against the other. Their Reconstruction vision encompassed women's suffrage as well as freed people's rights. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for an amazing education in such an important series of decades, ending the Civil War and following it. We've all learned a tremendous amount. A reminder to our audience, copies of both these authors' books can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As you order from the bookstore, input the code AMINTS25, and your copies will come signed by the author on a bookplate. The bookstore can send these special editions to you, your friends, and your family anywhere in the United States. You do need to order by 5 p.m. tomorrow, though. Now, moving toward closing, important in this month of Juneteenth, I want to thank our partners at American Ancestors 10 Million Names. Their teams of historians, genealogists, and volunteers are hard at work doing critical research to recover, restore, and remember the names of the 10 million descendants of enslaved people in our country. We invite you in our audience to get involved. As you can see on the next slide, get involved if your family, your relatives are or could be among the 10 million names. Visit 10millionnames.org to learn more. And now from our partners at Boston Public Library, they recommend that you go on bpl.org/events to see their resources, services, and programs. They do both online and in-person gatherings. And for your calendar, 2 events this fall in their Lowell Lecture Series. One on September 19, featuring film director and artist Paola Mendoza, and another on November 5, featuring costume designer Ruth Carter. Registration will open about 6 weeks before those 2 events. They wanted to call them to your attention. We at American Ancestors are delighted to present tonight's book talk. If you are researching a time, a person, or a family, my colleagues are here to help. You'll see on screen some of the many educational programs ahead, all of them hosted by our Brew Family Learning Center. Many of them are free to the public, as was tonight's talk. Also, a free service, you can chat with one of our genealogists about your family history or history question. Our mission in all we do at American Ancestors is to educate, inspire, and connect people. And we hope we're doing that tonight. As for you literary sorts, first, our thanks to Susan Kay and John D. Thompson for their sponsorship of free programming in the American Inspiration Series. Looking ahead, on July 7, just in time for summer travels, American style, we'll hear about Ike's road trip and the history of our U.S. highway system. Author Brian C. Black will be joined by presidential speechwriter Ted Widmer. They will share keen insights on America's car culture since Eisenhower's convoy across the country in 1919 as a 28-year-old lieutenant colonel. On July 22, we're presenting the book Fatherhood, A History of Love and Power. Author Augustine Sedgwick will be in dialogue with another current writer, Michelle Filgate, who has a deep understanding and insight on mothers and fathers, too. This book is the perfect activity for family historians and families together, insightful entertainment for all ages, full of history and facts on fathers and the tradition of fatherhood. And then at the end of July, in person at the Boston Public Library, we'll be looking at the Gilded Age, which I've learned a lot about tonight, especially the lives of Stanford White and Augustus St. Gaudens. The award-winning historian, Henry Winsick, will take to the stage and present his book in person, Stan and Gus, Art, Ardor, and the Friendship That Built the Gilded Age. Our wonderful and wise curator, Kurt DiCamillo, will join him in the conversation. We'll hope to see you at the Boston Public Library or back here online, as this event will be hybrid. But for now, we would like to thank all of us that are behind the scenes. We want to thank Ben and Manisha and Alan for their masterful discussion this evening. We also thank Kelly Nagel and also Ginevra Morse behind the scenes for their producing power in the Brew Family Learning Center and the GBH Forum Network for their technical prowess. And our greatest thanks, all of us, to our audience this evening. We appreciate your interest in history, America's history, the good and the bad, the facts and the family. We hope to see you soon again. Thank you to tonight's speakers, and a good night to all of you out there. Take care. Happy Juneteenth month.